Close your eyes and let the weight of the day soften around you, dissolving slowly, the way fog dissolves over still water at the edge of morning. Let your shoulders fall. Let your hands grow heavy. Feel the breath moving in and out of your body, slow and steady and unhurried, like the current of a great river that has been flowing long before you were born and will go on, flowing long after tonight has passed. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. There is only this voice and this story and the quiet dark behind your eyes. Tonight, we are going to drift back together through time, far back, through centuries and continents, and the long, slow turning of the world to a story about water and sickness and the remarkable patience of science and the even more remarkable patience of the human mind as it slowly, gently, learned to understand the invisible forces that shaped the lives of millions. It is a story about a city and a pump, about a physician who walked the streets of London with a notebook in hand, about the deep, still waters of the Ganges River Delta where everything began. You do not need to hold on to every name or every date. Let them pass through you like water. Let them carry you. If this voice helps you rest tonight, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby, but only if you are still awake enough to do so. And now, let us begin. Cholera is one of the oldest diseases for which we have anything resembling a detailed recorded history, and yet its full story was not understood until remarkably late. Not until the middle years of the 19th century, when a soft-spoken English physician named John Snow sat at a desk in London and began with tremendous patience and care to draw a map. The disease itself is caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, a small curved organism that lives in water and enters the human body through consumption of that contaminated water, whereupon it takes up residence in the intestinal tract and begins producing a toxin that disrupts the normal functioning of the cells lining the gut, causing the body to lose fluid at a rate that can, without treatment, prove fatal within hours. The symptoms are distinctive and were well known to physicians and laypeople alike, long before anyone understood what caused them. Those symptoms being an intense and rapid onset of watery fluid loss from the gastrointestinal tract, accompanied by severe dehydration, a loss of electrolytes, a state of weakness so profound that affected individuals could pass from apparent health to the very edge of death within a single afternoon. It is worth noting that the vast majority of people who carry and transmit Vibrio cholerae experience no symptoms at all, moving silently through the world as carriers, touching the surfaces of daily life, walking to the well, drawing water, and never knowing what they carry. The illness, when it does declare itself, does so with a swiftness that was, in the centuries before modern medicine, deeply bewildering to those who witnessed it. A person could sit down to dinner and be gravely ill by midnight, and it was this speed, this relentless urgency of onset, that made cholera one of the most feared and most misunderstood diseases of the ancient and early modern world, a disease that seemed to arrive without warning, to strike without reason, and to depart with equal inexplicability, leaving whole neighborhoods in silence. The earliest records that may describe cholera come from the ancient world, from the warm, fertile river deltas of the Indian subcontinent, where the bacterium appears to have existed in its natural reservoir for an indeterminate length of time, living in the brackish coastal waters and the slow sediment-rich channels of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers, with a quiet persistence that required no human host and no human suffering to sustain itself. The Greek physician Hippocrates, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, described conditions of the bowel that historians have speculated may have been cholera, though the evidence is uncertain, and the descriptions could equally apply to any number of gastrointestinal illnesses common to the ancient Mediterranean world. Galen, the great physician of the Roman imperial period, also described something he called a choleraic condition, from the Greek word chol, meaning bile, in a usage that reflected the ancient humoral framework for understanding disease rather than any specific knowledge of the organism we now call Vibrio cholerae. The Portuguese historian Gaspar Correa, writing in his 16th century work Legendary India, gave what many historians consider the first detailed Western clinical account of an epidemic that bore the clear hallmarks of cholera, describing a sudden and devastating outbreak in India in the year 1503 that killed a great many people in a very short period of time, with symptoms of rapid fluid loss and profound weakness. And that seemed to travel from place to place with the movement of people and armies along the river corridors of the subcontinent. Records from the Ganges Delta in the year 1543 describe an outbreak of a disease with what appear to be similar characteristics, though the documentation is fragmentary, and historians are careful to describe such early accounts as suggestive rather than definitive, reminding us that the absence of microscopic understanding meant that the people who recorded these outbreaks were describing what they saw without knowing what they were seeing. During this period of early documentation, cholera remained largely confined to the Indian subcontinent, circulating in the river delta regions of Bengal with a regularity that local populations had come to accept as part of the natural rhythm of life in those lowlands where the heat and the water and the density of human settlement created conditions in which the bacterium flourished with quiet consistency. The Ganges Delta is a place of extraordinary ecological complexity, a vast alluvial plain where dozens of rivers fan out toward the sea, through channels that shift and meander over decades, where the land is never entirely dry and never entirely still, where the monsoon comes each year with its tremendous weight of rain and transforms the landscape entirely, flooding fields and roads and settlements, mixing the water of the river with the water of the sky and the accumulated waste of a dense human population into a great seasonal convergence that, as we now understand, provided ideal conditions for cholera to persist and spread. The waters of the Bay of Bengal, particularly in the estuary regions near the mouth of the Ganges, harbour Vibrio cholerae in a free-living state, attached to the tiny crustaceans called copepods that form the base of the marine food chain, living in plankton blooms that expand and contract with the temperature and salinity of the water, surviving without any human host through the long intervals between human epidemics and reseeding those epidemics when conditions brought contaminated water into contact with human consumption. This ecological relationship between the bacterium and its aquatic environment was not understood, of course, in the early centuries of recorded observation, and people living in the delta regions developed their own explanations and their own cautionary practices, many of them woven into the fabric of religious and cultural life. Practices related to the purification of water, the handling of the dead, the propitiation of deities associated with disease and healing, all of which amounted to an accumulated folk epidemiology that was imperfect, but not entirely without wisdom, in its instinctive recognition that cholera had something to do with water. It is worth pausing here, in these early centuries, to appreciate just how slowly knowledge travels when it has no infrastructure to carry it. No journals, no telegraphs, no international boards of health, no mechanisms for comparing the observations of a physician in Calcutta with those of a physician in Constantinople or a village healer in the Nile Delta. The world of the early modern period was a world of isolated epistemic communities, each developing its own frameworks for understanding disease, from the evidence available to it locally, and the absence of any shared methodology for comparing and analyzing those observations meant that the same disease could be observed independently by hundreds of practitioners over centuries without any cumulative understanding emerging from those observations. There were moments of clarity, moments when an observant person noted a pattern that, in retrospect, pointed directly toward the truth. A physician who remarked that the sick tended to live near certain water sources. A local administrator who noticed that the illness followed certain trade routes. A religious leader who associated outbreaks with the consumption of water from particular wells or rivers. But none of these observations existed in a context that could magnify and test and refine them, and so they remained isolated insights, recorded in local languages, in local archives, waiting for the infrastructure of modern science to give them meaning. It was not until the 19th century when that infrastructure began, slowly and imperfectly, to take shape, that the history of cholera became the history of epidemiology. And it was not until a particular morning in late August of 1854, in a narrow street in the Soho district of London, that the most important insight of all arrived in the careful mind of a physician who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. The year 1817 is the year when cholera formally entered the modern historical record as a pandemic disease, the year when it ceased to be a regional affliction of the Indian subcontinent and became something larger and more terrible, a force that would move across the entire connected world with a new kind of speed and reach, carried by the ships and soldiers and trade caravans of an increasingly globalized age into populations that had no prior exposure and therefore no accumulated resistance, however partial or imperfect, to its effects. The first pandemic began in the Bengal region of India, near the city of Calcutta, in the year 1817, when an outbreak of unusual severity emerged from the delta regions and spread outward along the networks of human movement with a swiftness that alarmed colonial administrators and military commanders alike, striking down soldiers and merchants and pilgrims and villagers without apparent discrimination, moving through army encampments and trading posts and river towns with a terrible efficiency. Within the span of a few years, the disease had travelled to Southeast Asia, carried by the ships of the British East India Company and the trading vessels of the Indian Ocean, networks reaching the coasts of modern Indonesia, where records from the island of Java alone document the deaths of approximately 100,000 people in the year 1820, a number that gives some sense of the scale of the catastrophe that was unfolding. The disease moved onward to China and Japan, to the Persian Gulf and the shores of East Africa, to the Mediterranean coast and the doorstep of Europe, following the routes of commerce and colonialism, with the patient tenacity of an organism that required only water and human movement to sustain its progress across the world. By the early 1820s, cholera had spread to an extent that no previous outbreak had achieved, and then, with a quietness almost as unsettling as its arrival, it retreated, drawing back to its reservoir in the Bay of Bengal. By approximately 1823 and 1824, leaving behind it a world that had been changed in ways it did not yet fully understand, and that would very shortly be tested again. The first pandemic faded, and the world breathed, and the bacterium waited in its warm coastal waters. And then, in the year 1829, or thereabouts, the second pandemic began, emerging once again from the Bengal region with the same unhurried certainty as the first, as though it had simply been resting, gathering itself, waiting for the conditions of climate and human movement and population density to align themselves once more into the configuration it required. The second pandemic traveled the same routes as the first, but reached further, moving into Russia by the year 1830, advancing through the vast territories of the Russian Empire with a speed that alarmed the government in St. Petersburg and led to the imposition of quarantine measures, travel restrictions, and a general atmosphere of official anxiety that itself contributed to social unrest and occasional violence, as populations who did not understand the disease or the measures being taken against it responded with fear and suspicion toward the authorities who seemed to be controlling their movements and restricting their trade without adequate explanation. From Russia, the disease moved into Finland and into Poland, where its arrival intersected with the Polish November Uprising of 1830, creating a confluence of political and medical catastrophe that deepened the misery of an already suffering population in ways that no single narrative can fully capture. The sick was dying in the streets of Warsaw while the city was simultaneously convulsed by the violence of rebellion and the chaos of military occupation. The disease reached England in October of 1831, arriving in the northeastern port city of Sunderland, carried in the bilge water, or the bodies of sailors returning from the Baltic trade routes and making landfall in a country that had heard of cholera, had read alarming reports from India and Russia and Poland, but had never seen it and had no established framework for managing it. The physicians of England being as uncertain about its cause and its treatment as they were about how to prevent its further spread. The arrival of cholera in England in 1831 and the epidemic that followed through 1832 was an event of profound cultural and political significance, not merely a medical crisis, but a social upheaval that exposed with painful clarity the fault lines of a society undergoing rapid and disorienting change. A society in which the Industrial Revolution was drawing hundreds of thousands of people from rural areas into the crowded, poorly built, and wholly inadequate housing of the new industrial cities, where they lived in conditions of density and squalor that provided exactly the environment cholera required. The city of London in the 1830s was a place of extraordinary contrast and extraordinary density, a city of approximately 1.5 million people, the largest city in the world, where the wealthy inhabited their wide streets and well-appointed houses with adequate water supplies and domestic servants to manage the practicalities of daily life, and where the poor crowded into tenements and cellars and courts so narrow that two people could barely pass one another, sharing water sources and waste disposal in arrangements that made the transmission of disease through contaminated water not merely possible but essentially inevitable. The Thames, that great river around which the city had always organized itself, was by the 1830s simultaneously the city's primary source of drinking water, drawn from its surface by the private water companies that supplied the city through a network of pipes and cisterns, and the city's primary sewer, receiving the outflow of hundreds of thousands of cesspits and drainage channels that carried the waste of the city directly into the water that would shortly be pumped back into homes and neighborhoods. and the public drinking fountains at which the poor, who could not afford the piped supply, regularly gathered. The epidemic of 1831 and 1832 killed approximately 52,000 people in Britain, according to records that historians consider likely to underrepresent the true toll given the imperfect registration of deaths in that period, and the reluctance of local officials in many areas to report cases of a disease that carried a social stigma of poverty and filth, a stigma that reflected the common belief of the time that cholera was, in some sense, a consequence of the moral as well as the physical condition of those it killed. This belief that the poor were especially susceptible to cholera because of some quality of their character or their habits, rather than simply because of their exposure to contaminated water, was not merely a piece of casual prejudice, but was woven into the formal medical thinking of the era, expressed most coherently in the framework known as miasma theory, the dominant paradigm for understanding the transmission of disease in the 19th century, a framework that held that illnesses like cholera were caused by the inhalation of noxious vapors arising from the decomposition of organic matter in the environment, from the rotting garbage and animal waste and human excrement that accumulated in the streets and courts of the poorer districts of every city, from the stagnant water of low-lying areas, from the exhalations of rivers and swamps and tidal flats at low water, from the general atmosphere of physical decay that seemed to envelop the dwelling places of the poor. Miasma theory was not without its internal coherence, and it was not entirely without usefulness. For the measures it recommended, namely, the removal of filth, the improvement of ventilation, the drainage of standing water, the clearing of refuse from the streets, were in fact measures that reduced the transmission of cholera, even if for entirely the wrong reasons, since they reduced the contamination of water sources, even though the theory attributed their benefit to the purification of air. William Farr, a distinguished statistician and the compiler of national mortality data for England, was among the most sophisticated proponents of miasma theory in the mid-19th century, and his work demonstrated a remarkably consistent relationship between the elevation of a neighborhood above sea level and its mortality from cholera, a relationship so statistically precise that it seemed to offer powerful evidence for the idea that the lower, damper, more malodorous areas of the city were producing miasmatic vapors that killed their inhabitants in proportion to the density and persistence of those vapors. What Farr's elegant statistics did not reveal, and what would only become clear in retrospect, was that elevation was correlated, not with miasmatic air, but with proximity to the Thames and its contaminated tributaries, so that the statistical relationship he had identified was real and reproducible, but pointed, with supreme irony, at exactly the opposite conclusion from the one he drew, pointing not at the air, but at the water, not at what people breathed, but at what they drank. Meanwhile, across the decades of the 1830s and 1840s, the intellectual foundations of a different understanding of cholera were being laid, quietly and without fanfare, by a small number of physicians who had noticed things that the miasma framework struggled to explain. Physicians who had observed that the disease seemed to cluster in particular households or particular streets, rather than spreading uniformly across an area as one might expect a diffusion of poisoned air to do, who had noted that people working in close proximity to the sick without consuming the same water often escaped the disease entirely, while people living at some distance from the known outbreak, who shared a water supply with the affected area, sometimes sickened and died. John Snow, born in York in 1813, the son of a labourer who had educated himself through extraordinary diligence and personal discipline, and had become, by the late 1840s, one of the most respected physicians in London, both for his work in the young field of anaesthesia, to which he made fundamental contributions, and for his careful clinical observation of the patients he saw in his practice in Soho, had been thinking about cholera since the epidemic of 1831 and 1832, when he was barely out of his teens and working as a medical apprentice in the northeast of England, watching the disease move through the mining communities of County Durham with a pattern that seemed, to his careful eye, to have something to do with the way the miners shared food and water in the cramped conditions of their underground work. Snow published a formal paper in 1849, during the second great epidemic to strike England, in which he set out his hypothesis that cholera was transmitted not through the air, but through the ingestion of a specific material, a morbid material as he called it, present in the evacuations of cholera patients, and capable of contaminating water supplies, a hypothesis that was received with polite skepticism by most of his colleagues, who found the miasmatic framework more intuitively satisfying and were not yet ready to abandon it on the basis of a single, thoughtful, but unproven argument. He would wait and observe and continue gathering evidence, and the disease would return. And when it did, in the late summer of 1854, John Snow would be ready. The summer of 1854 was, by all accounts, a warm and dry one in London, the kind of summer that brought people into the streets and squares of the city in the evenings, that made the dark warrens of Soho feel temporarily less oppressive, that encouraged the residents of the densely inhabited courts and alleys around Broad Street to fetch their water from the neighbourhood pump and stand for a moment in the evening air before returning to their rooms. Soho in 1854 was a neighbourhood of mixed character, neither the poorest district in London, nor among the more comfortable, a place of tradespeople and artisans and labourers and small shopkeepers, of lodging houses and workshops, and the particular kind of urban density that results when a city grows faster than its infrastructure, when more and more people require housing in an area that was not designed to hold them, and that has no mechanism for expanding to accommodate them, except to subdivide what already exists, to add floors to buildings, to build in gardens, to let cellars become homes. The water pump on Broad Street, now Broadwick Street, was one of several public pumps in the neighbourhood, and it was widely regarded as producing water of particularly good quality, clean and cold and pleasant to the taste, and residents of the surrounding streets preferred it to other local sources, going out of their way to use it, even when other pumps were closer to their homes. The pump drew its water from a well sunk into the ground beneath the street, and that well, as would only be discovered much later, was located within a very short distance of an old cesspit, the lining of which had become degraded over time, permitting contaminated material to seep slowly through the soil and into the water that the pump drew up to the surface and offered, with perfect impartiality, to everyone who came to drink. On the night of the 31st of August 1854, something changed in the character of the water at the Broad Street pump, and within a very few days, the neighbourhood around it would experience one of the most intensively studied, most historically significant, and most quietly transformative events in the entire history of medicine. The outbreak began, as cholera outbreaks so often did, with a small cluster of cases that were at first unremarkable, cases that might easily have been attributed to any of the dozen other ailments that circulated through a crowded urban neighborhood in the summer months, and that did not, in their first hours, announce themselves as the leading edge of something significant. But within a day or two of the 31st of August, the deaths began to accumulate with a speed that was unmistakable and terrifying. 127 people dying in the first 3 days of the outbreak, 500 dying within 10 days, 616 dead within a month, in an area of a few city blocks, in a neighborhood where people lived so close together that the sound of a neighbor's cough was as familiar as the sound of one's own breathing. The streets around Broad Street emptied with a swiftness that said everything about how deeply the memory of cholera was embedded in the population of London. People who had lived through the epidemics of 1832 and 1849, recognizing the symptoms and the pattern instantly, and fleeing if they had anywhere to flee to, leaving behind those who could not or would not go, the elderly and the very young, those with no resources to move, those who could not bring themselves to abandon their homes and their livelihoods. John Snow, who lived and practiced in the neighborhood, heard of the outbreak within hours of its beginning and began almost immediately to gather information, moving through the streets with his notebook, knocking on doors, asking questions with the quiet persistence of a man who had been waiting 5 years for exactly this kind of opportunity, who had a hypothesis ready and a methodology prepared, and needed only the evidence to test them. He was not, at this point, trying to save the neighborhood, though that would become one of the consequences of his work. He was trying to understand. He was trying to map. Snow's method was, in its essentials, a form of what we would now call field epidemiology, the systematic collection of information about who became ill, where they lived, what they ate, what they drank, and what patterns emerged from the comparison of those who were sick with those who were well. And it was a method that was both simple and radical. Simple in that it required no special equipment and no laboratory, and radical in that it required a willingness to question the dominant theoretical framework of the day and to follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of where that happened to be. Snow obtained from the local register of deaths the addresses of the people who had died in the outbreak and began plotting those deaths on a map of the neighborhood, marking each death with a small bar at the address where it had occurred, so that the map gradually filled with clusters of marks that corresponded, with striking visual clarity, to the area immediately surrounding the Broad Street pump. He also mapped the locations of the other water pumps in the neighborhood, the Carnaby Street pump, the Little Marlborough Street pump, the Rupert Street pump, and observed that the deaths clustered not around these pumps, but around the Broad Street pump, specifically a spatial distribution that was extraordinarily difficult to explain on the basis of miasmatic theory, since the air of a neighborhood does not conveniently concentrate itself around a single point in the way that these deaths had concentrated themselves around a single pump. He then began to examine the apparent exceptions to the pattern, the cases of death that had occurred at some distance from the Broad Street pump, and the cases of survival that occurred in its immediate vicinity, because it is in the exceptions that the truth of a hypothesis is most clearly tested, and Snow understood this with the precision of a mind that had been trained not merely to observe patterns, but to interrogate them. Among the most compelling of these exceptions was the case of a widow, Mrs. Susanna Ellie, who had lived at some distance from Soho, in the neighborhood of Hampstead, far to the north of the Broad Street pump, and who had died of cholera during the outbreak. without any apparent connection to the Soho neighborhood. Snow investigated and discovered that Mrs. Ellie had, in the days before her illness, received deliveries of water, specifically from the Broad Street pump, carried to her at her request, because she had formerly lived in Soho and preferred the taste of that particular water to any available near her Hampstead home, and this discovery that a woman who had not set foot in the neighbourhood could nonetheless contract the disease by consuming its water was exactly the kind of evidence that Snow needed to demonstrate that the disease was carried by the water itself, and not by anything particular to the atmosphere of the Broad Street vicinity. He also investigated the case of a large brewery located almost directly on Broad Street, whose workers had been entirely spared during the outbreak, and discovered that the brewery provided its workers with an allocation of beer as part of their daily employment, meaning that they had no need to use the public water pump, and instead consumed a beverage that, being brewed with boiled water and containing alcohol, was effectively free of the bacterium, even though no one at the time understood why. He noted similarly that the residents of a workhouse in the neighborhood had been largely unaffected, and discovered that the workhouse had its own private well and did not use the Broad Street pump. Another exception that confirmed, rather than undermined, the pattern he had identified. Each of these exceptions, patiently investigated and explained, added weight to the case he was building. A case made not from theory, but from the patient accumulation of specific, verifiable, locally grounded evidence. On the 7th of September 1854, Snow attended a meeting of the Board of Guardians of St. James's Parish, the local administrative body responsible for public welfare in the Soho area, and presented his findings to that body with the same quiet, methodical clarity with which he had assembled them, showing them the map, explaining the pattern of deaths, describing the exceptions and how they supported, rather than contradicted his conclusion, and arguing that the handle of the Broad Street pump should be removed as a precautionary measure to prevent further use of the contaminated water. The Board of Guardians, confronted with this evidence by a physician of acknowledged distinction and considerable local standing, agreed, and the following day, the handle of the Broad Street pump was removed, an act so simple and so small in its physical dimensions, and so enormous in its historical significance, that it has become one of the defining images of the history of public health. A single iron handle taken from a water pump on a quiet street in London, representing the moment when the relationship between contaminated water and epidemic disease was made demonstrably visible to the institutions responsible for managing public health. The outbreak had already begun to decline by the time the handle was removed, as many residents had fled the neighborhood and others had died. And so the precise contribution of the pump removal to the further decline of the outbreak is difficult to isolate, but what Snow's investigation had accomplished was something more durable than the management of a single outbreak. It had produced a body of evidence, a methodology, and a conceptual framework that would, over the decades that followed, gradually transform the way medicine understood the relationship between environment, water, and disease. Henry Whitehead, the curate of St. Luke's Church on Berwick Street, adjacent to Broad Street, was a man who had initially been skeptical of Snow's conclusions, having walked the same streets and spoken with the same residents during the outbreak, and arrived, from his own observations, at a different interpretation, one more consistent with the prevailing miasmatic understanding. Whitehead was born in 1825 and was, at the time of the 1854 outbreak, a young clergyman who had developed a deep and affectionate knowledge of the Soho community through his pastoral work, visiting the sick and the dying in their homes, sitting with bereaved families, recording the circumstances of deaths with the conscientious thoroughness of a man who felt a genuine obligation to understand the suffering he was witnessing. It was Whitehead who, in the weeks after the pump handle was removed, conducted his own independent and extraordinarily thorough investigation of the outbreak on behalf of a local committee established to examine the causes of the epidemic, and who eventually, through his meticulous interviews with surviving residents and his careful examination of the addresses and circumstances of the dead, not only confirmed Snow's central conclusion about the pump, but identified the index case of the entire outbreak, the initial source of the contamination that had entered the well and infected the water, and set the whole terrible sequence in motion. That index case was a 5-month-old infant named Francis Lewis, who had been ill with an unrelated gastrointestinal condition in the days before the outbreak began, and whose soiled diapers had been emptied into a cesspit located within a very few feet of the Broad Street well, the lining of the cesspit having degraded sufficiently to allow the contaminated liquid to seep into the well water, carrying the bacterium from a single sick infant through the water supply to hundreds of people in the surrounding streets. The investigation of the 1854 Broad Street outbreak did not immediately overturn the miasma theory or instantly transform the practice of public health in London or anywhere else, because intellectual revolutions in medicine, like intellectual revolutions in most fields of human endeavor, do not happen in a single moment, but rather accumulate over time, building through the slow accretion of evidence and the gradual erosion of older certainties. And because the institutions and the individual practitioners who had built their professional identities around the miasmatic framework were not prepared to abandon it simply because a single outbreak had been mapped with unusual thoroughness. The Board of Health, the central government body responsible for managing the epidemic, published its official report on the 1854 cholera outbreaks in London and attributed the Soho epidemic to miasma, declining to accept Snow's conclusions despite the evidence he had presented, a decision that reflected both the institutional inertia of established scientific paradigms and the genuine difficulty of abandoning a framework that had, in its own terms, explained a great deal and guided a great many practical measures over the preceding decades. Snow himself continued his work with characteristic patience, publishing the second and expanded edition of his treatise on the mode of communication of cholera in 1855, in which he combined his account of the Broad Street outbreak with the results of his grand experiment, a larger and more statistically powerful study comparing the cholera mortality rates in areas of London supplied by two different water companies, the Southwark and Vauxhall Company and the Lambeth Company, the former drawing its water from sewer-diluted sections of the Thames, and the latter from a cleaner upstream source, with the results showing, with the kind of statistical clarity that was difficult to dismiss, that the areas supplied by the contaminated company suffered dramatically higher rates of cholera death than those supplied by the clean company, regardless of any other variables. It is worth noting, as we rest here in the quiet of this account, that John Snow did not live to see his ideas fully accepted by the medical establishment, did not live to see the water infrastructure of London rebuilt along the lines that his work implied, and did not live to hear the name of Vibrio cholerae spoken in connection with the disease he had studied so carefully and for so long. Snow died on the 16th of June, 1858, at the age of 45, of a stroke 4 years after the Broad Street outbreak, and 3 years after the publication of his most important work, in a state of considerable professional frustration at the resistance his conclusions had met from the majority of his colleagues. He was, by the time of his death, a respected figure in London medicine, celebrated above all for his contributions to anesthesia, particularly his administration of chloroform to Queen Victoria during the births of her last 2 children, but his work on cholera was still regarded with polite skepticism by most of the medical community, and the full significance of what he had done at Broad Street would not be appreciated until decades later, when the germ theory of disease had become established and the intellectual framework that had made his conclusions seem improbable had been dismantled. In that same summer of 1858, London experienced what came to be known as the Great Stink, an extended period of exceptionally hot weather, during which the Thames, still carrying the untreated sewage of the entire city, produced an odour so overwhelming that the windows of the Houses of Parliament had to be hung with curtains soaked in chloride of lime in an attempt to make the chambers habitable. And that finally forced the government to act decisively on the sanitation crisis that Snow and others had been describing for years, approving the plans of the engineer Joseph Bazalgette to construct a comprehensive underground sewer system for London at a cost and on a scale that had previously seemed unthinkable. And so, as the decade of the 1850s drew toward its close, the City of London was beginning, slowly and imperfectly, and with all the institutional inertia and political compromise that characterize large public works in any era, to rebuild itself in ways that would, over the coming years and decades, fundamentally alter its relationship with cholera. The Bazalgette sewer system, constructed through the 1860s, at a cost of approximately £4.5 million, and comprising over 80 miles of main sewers and more than 1,000 miles of local sewers, redirected the waste of the city away from the Thames within the city and carried it instead to outfall points far to the east, where it could be discharged into the tidal river at ebb tide and carried out to sea without returning to the drinking water supply of the city's population. The effect of this infrastructure on the frequency and severity of cholera epidemics in London was dramatic and measurable, though it would take one more outbreak, the epidemic of 1866, to demonstrate the connection with the clarity that policymakers required. That epidemic being notably concentrated in the East End districts, still served by the contaminated water of the old system, while the areas now connected to Bazalgette sewers and the improved water supply that went with them remained largely free of the disease, a natural experiment in municipal engineering that provided, in practical terms, a powerful confirmation of the waterborne theory of cholera transmission, even in the absence of full scientific consensus about the specific organism responsible. The miasma theory was eroding, gradually and unevenly, under the accumulated weight of evidence that pointed consistently in a different direction, and while the final demonstration of the bacterial cause of cholera still lay ahead, in the laboratories of Florence and later of Egypt and India, the practical transformation of London's water infrastructure had already begun the work that science would eventually complete, the work of removing cholera from the streets of the world's great cities, one pipe and one pump handle at a time. The London into which cholera arrived in 1831 was a city engaged in a profound and disorienting transformation. A city that had grown faster than any urban settlement in human history had ever grown before, swelling from a population of roughly 900,000 at the close of the 18th century to well over 1.5 million by the time the first cholera ships docked at Sunderland. A growth so rapid and so poorly managed that the physical fabric of the city had simply not kept pace with the human beings it was being asked to contain. The East End parishes of Whitechapel and Bethnal Green and Stepney had been, within living memory, market gardens and open fields at the edge of the city, and they had been converted within a generation into dense warrens of terraced housing, and back-to-back courts and subdivided Georgian townhouses, in which single rooms housed entire families and entire courts, shared a single standpipe or a single communal pump for their daily water needs. The River Thames flowed through the centre of this world with a kind of terrible indifference, receiving into its grey waters the drainage from hundreds of thousands of cesspits, the overflow of slaughterhouses and tanning yards and soap factories and gasworks, the accumulated biological waste of a population that had no sanitation infrastructure adequate to its numbers, and discharging that mixture downstream in the general direction of the sea, while simultaneously serving as the primary source from which the private water companies of the city drew the supply they processed, such as it was, and piped into the homes and neighbourhoods of their customers. The contrast between the water supply available to the wealthy and that available to the poor was not merely a matter of cost, though cost was a significant factor, but a matter of physical infrastructure, the wealthy being connected to piped supplies that, while still drawn from the contaminated Thames, at least arrived in covered pipes that excluded some of the more immediate sources of recontamination, while the poor relied on standpipes and public pumps that were often directly influenced by local groundwater and local cesspits in ways that made their water on any given day a variable and unpredictable mixture of what the ground beneath their streets had to offer. The physician and social reformer Thomas Southwood Smith, writing in the 1820s and 1830s, documented with meticulous care the physical conditions of the poorest London neighbourhoods, describing streets where the accumulation of refuse and the overflow of cesspits had created a permanent layer of organic material underfoot, where the walls of houses were visibly damp with the moisture that permeated up from the saturated soil below, where the air was dense with the smell of decomposition, and where children grew up in conditions that no physician of any theoretical persuasion could regard as compatible with health. Southwood Smith was a convinced miasmatist, attributing the disease burden of these neighbourhoods to the poisoned air they produced, rather than to their contaminated water. But his documentation of the conditions themselves was accurate and valuable, regardless of the theoretical framework through which he interpreted them, providing a baseline description of the urban poverty that cholera found waiting for it when it arrived in England. The cholera epidemic of 1831 and 1832 killed approximately 52,000 people in Britain as a whole, with London bearing a disproportionate share of the toll. The deaths concentrated with terrible predictability in the poorest and most densely inhabited districts, in the courts of Bermondsey and the alleys of Whitechapel, and the riverside communities of Wapping and Rotherhithe, where the water was worst, and the Hazing was most crowded, and the bodies of the dead were handled with the least care and the most haste. The epidemic produced, alongside its immediate toll of human life, a secondary wave of social anxiety and political tension that in some ways paralleled what was happening simultaneously in continental Europe. The, the poor of England being no less suspicious of the medical and political establishments than the poor of Russia or Poland, and the imposition of quarantine measures, and the forcible removal of the sick to poorly regarded cholera hospitals, producing a degree of resistance and resentment that occasionally expressed itself in public disturbances and in the kind of dark folk theories about the intentions of the authorities that circulate in any community confronting a disease it does not understand. There were widespread rumors in some districts that the cholera hospitals were not places of treatment, but places of disposal, that the poor were being sent there to die and to provide bodies for the medical schools. Rumors that were not entirely detached from reality, given the notorious trade in cadavers that had accompanied the growth of medical education in the early 19th century, and that had only recently been given a more regulated legal framework by the Anatomy Act of 1832. It is worth noting, gently and without judgment, that the fear and the suspicion were entirely understandable responses to a situation in which the poor were being told, by the same authorities who had failed to provide them with adequate water or housing or food, that they needed to submit to measures that would disrupt their work and their family life and their access to their own sick and dying, and that this disruption was in their own best interest. A message that has a particular kind of hollow resonance when delivered by those whose own material interests are well protected. The miasma theory that shaped the official response to cholera in England was not merely an abstract medical doctrine, but a framework that had deep roots in the classical tradition of Western medicine, drawing on 2,000 years of accumulated thought about the relationship between environment and health, thought that had been systematized in the works of Hippocrates and Galen, and elaborated through the medieval and early modern periods into a set of assumptions so deeply embedded in medical educations and practice that they had acquired a kind of axiomatic quality, seeming less like a theory subject to testing and revision, and more like a description of the obvious. The core premise of miasma theory was the idea that disease arose from the decay of organic matter, from the exhalation of putrefying substances into the atmosphere, from the specific quality of air in low-lying, damp, and poorly ventilated places, a premise that derived, at least in part, from the very accurate observation that people living in marshy, low-lying areas did tend to suffer higher rates of certain diseases, most notably the intermittent fevers we now identify as malaria, a disease whose name itself encodes the miasmatic theory in its Italian etymology of mala aria, or bad air. The association between low elevation, damp conditions and disease was, as William Farr's later statistical work would demonstrate, a genuine and reproducible empirical relationship for cholera, as well as for malaria, and this genuine statistical relationship between environmental conditions and disease burden gave miasma theory a degree of apparent empirical support that made it much more durable than a purely speculative framework would have been. Edwin Chadwick, the great Victorian sanitary reformer, and the principal author of the landmark report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population of Great Britain, published in 1842, was perhaps the most influential practical proponent of miasma theory in the mid-19th century, a man whose enormous energy and administrative ability drove through a series of sanitary reforms that, based on entirely incorrect theoretical premises, happened to substantially improve public health by cleaning up the physical environment and reducing the contamination of water supplies as a practical consequence of measures nominally aimed at purifying the air. Chadwick believed, with a conviction that no amount of contrary evidence could easily shake, that the way to prevent cholera and typhus and the other great epidemic diseases of poverty was to remove the sources of miasmatic exhalation from the vicinity of human habitation, to drain standing water, to remove refuse, to improve ventilation, to flush the cesspits and sewers, and carry their contents away from the city with the greatest possible speed. And it was this last measure, the flushing of London's old cesspits and their drainage directly into the Thames, that constituted one of the great unintended ironies of Victorian public health, since it dramatically worsened the contamination of the river from which a large part of the population drew its drinking water, potentially increasing cholera mortality in the short term, while being pursued in the sincere belief that it was preventing it. The relationship between the Thames and London's health was a subject of growing concern and increasing scientific attention through the 1840s and 185 zeros, the river having become by that period a body of water so heavily loaded with organic waste that its condition was visible and olfactory as well as epidemiologically significant, its colour varying from the brown of suspended sediment to darker and more troubling hues in the summer months, when decomposition was most active, its smell permeating the riverside neighbourhoods with the kind of pervasive, heavy presence that those who experienced it described with a consistency and intensity, suggesting that it was not merely unpleasant, but genuinely oppressive. The physician, John Simon, who served as medical officer of health for the City of London from 1848, and later as medical officer to the General Board of Health, was among the most scientifically sophisticated of the Victorian public health officials, a man whose theoretical convictions were more flexible than Chadwick's, and whose approach to evidence was more genuinely empirical, and who, over the course of his long career, would gradually move from a position of qualified support for miasma theory toward a more nuanced view that acknowledged the evidence for specific modes of disease transmission, including the waterborne transmission that Snow had proposed. Simon's annual reports to the City of London, meticulously researched and clearly written, provide one of the best contemporary records of the state of public health knowledge and public health policy in mid-Victorian England, and they document with particular clarity the gradual erosion of the miasmatic consensus under the pressure of accumulated evidence, an erosion that was slow and uneven and complicated by professional loyalties and institutional inertia. But that was nonetheless proceeding, year by year, through the 1850s and into the 1860s. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the intellectual difficulty of the position occupied by thoughtful physicians like Simon, men who were trained in one theoretical framework and who were observing evidence that seemed to point toward a different one, who were committed to following the evidence wherever it led, but who also understood that the evidence was genuinely ambiguous and that the miasmatic framework, whatever its theoretical deficiencies, had produced practical measures that appeared to reduce disease, and who therefore could not simply dismiss it as wrong without risking the abandonment of interventions that were, whatever their theoretical justification, actually helping people. William Farr deserves a longer and more careful consideration than he sometimes receives in the standard historical account of the cholera debates, because his work was not merely the foil against which Snow's genius was set, but was itself a genuinely remarkable contribution to the emerging science of epidemiology, a contribution that used the tools of statistics and population analysis to reveal patterns in disease mortality that had never previously been visible, and that laid important methodological groundwork, even where its theoretical conclusions were incorrect. Farr was born in 1807 in Shropshire, the son of a farm labourer, educated through a combination of personal industry and the patronage of a local benefactor who recognized his unusual intellectual gifts and trained in medicine in Paris and London before becoming, in 1839, the compiler of abstracts in the newly established General Register Office, the government body responsible for the centralized registration of births, marriages, and deaths in England and Wales. The creation of the General Register Office was itself a significant institutional development, representing the first systematic attempt by the British government to collect and analyze demographic data on a national scale, and far shaped that institution's approach to mortality, statistics, in ways that made it one of the most sophisticated instruments of epidemiological observation in the world, developing standardized categories for cause of death, insisting on the consistent application of those categories across different registrars and different regions, and using the resulting data to construct analyses of the relationship between social conditions and mortality that were unprecedented in their scope and precision. His elevation law, developed in the context of cholera and published in the early 1850s, demonstrated with considerable statistical elegance that mortality from cholera in London was inversely related with the elevation of the district in which people lived, with the highest mortality rates in the lowest lying areas near the Thames, and progressively lower rates at higher elevations, a finding that Farr interpreted as supporting the miasmatic theory, but that Snow recognized correctly as reflecting the geographical distribution of contaminated water supplies rather than the distribution of miasmatic air. The correspondence between Snow and Farr during the period of the 1854 outbreak and its aftermath is a remarkable document in the history of scientific disagreement. Two intelligent and serious men, both committed to following evidence toward truth, and both genuinely respectful of each other's work, approaching the same body of data from different theoretical starting points, and arriving at different conclusions with a dignity and intellectual honesty that stands in some contrast to the more heated debates of the 20th century. Farr had access to the same mortality data that Snow was using, and he was in some respects a more accomplished statistician, but his theoretical priors led him to ask different questions of that data and to interpret its patterns in ways that confirmed, rather than challenged, his existing framework, a reminder that even the most careful and rigorous empirical work is shaped by the questions we ask of it and the frameworks within which we formulate those questions. What ultimately changed Farr's view was not a single dramatic piece of evidence, but the slow accumulation of studies through the late 1850s and early 1860s, including Snow's grand experiment comparing the two water companies, and above all the epidemic of 1866, which Farr himself analysed, and which showed so clearly the correspondence between contaminated water supply and cholera mortality that he publicly acknowledged, with considerable grace, that Snow had been essentially correct, and that the waterborne theory deserved to replace the miasmatic framework as the basis for understanding cholera transmission. His acknowledgement was generous and precise, noting that while the physical improvements associated with miasma theory had benefited public health, the theoretical mechanism that Snow had proposed was the correct one, and that future preventive efforts should be directed specifically at the purity of water supplies, rather than at the general removal of filth from the atmosphere. Farr's intellectual journey from miasmatist to convert, conducted over the better part of 2 decades, and documented in his annual reports and his correspondence and his published analyses, is in many ways as important a story in the history of epidemiology as Snow's investigation of the Broad Street pump, because it demonstrates how evidence accumulates and how theoretical frameworks shift, not in a single moment of revelation, but through the slow, patient work of observation and analysis. That is the actual texture of scientific progress. John Snow's own intellectual journey toward the waterborne theory of cholera had begun long before the summer of 1854, rooted in observations he had made as a young medical apprentice during the first English cholera epidemic of 1831 and 1832, and developed through 2 decades of careful thinking and clinical observation that preceded his great opportunity at Broad Street by enough years to make his readiness for that moment something more than coincidence. Snow was born on the 15th of March, 1813, the eldest of 9 children of William Snow, a labourer in the coal yards of York, and his early life was one of modest circumstances and significant educational ambition. His intelligence recognized early by his teachers and supported by his family's willingness to invest in his advancement, even at the cost of considerable sacrifice. He was apprenticed at the age of 14 to William Hardcastle, a surgeon in Newcastle upon Tyne, and it was in that capacity, in the colliery villages of the northeast, that he first encountered cholera, watching it move through the mining communities of Killingworth and the surrounding area during the epidemic of 1831, with the attentive eyes of a young man who was not yet a physician, but who already had the habit of careful observation and the temperament for patient inquiry. He noted, as others had noted before him, that cholera seemed to spread through communities in ways that suggested direct transmission rather than atmospheric diffusion, that the miners who shared water and food in underground workings seemed to pass the disease of themselves in patterns consistent with specific exposure rather than with the general contamination of the air they breathed, that the families of sick miners often became sick themselves in temporal and spatial patterns that suggested contact with the sick person or with contaminated materials rather than with some diffuse environmental factor. These observations were not in themselves conclusive, and Snow did not at this stage have a fully formed theory to set against the miasmatic framework, but they planted in him a skepticism about that framework that would grow over the following years as he trained in London, passed his medical qualifications, and established himself in practice in the Soho neighbourhood that would later become the theatre of his most important work. Snow's practice was at Saxville Street, and his home and consulting rooms were close enough to the Broad Street pump that he was, in a sense, a neighbour of the outbreak he would investigate, a member of the community whose suffering he would spend the weeks of September 1854 trying to understand and document. During the epidemic of 1848 and 1849, which killed over 53,000 people in England and Wales, Snow had the opportunity to test his developing hypothesis more systematically, visiting cholera wards, conducting interviews with patients and their families, and gathering the kind of detailed case histories that allowed him to begin identifying patterns of transmission that were consistent with a waterborne mechanism, publishing his first major statement of the waterborne theory in a paper of 1849 titled On the Mode of Communication of Cholera a document that was received with polite attention and qualified skepticism by the medical community, that community finding his hypothesis interesting, but his evidence insufficiently compelling to overturn a well-established theoretical framework. The 1849 paper was the first act of a scientific argument that would not be resolved, even in Snow's own lifetime, but that had been set in motion with a clarity and a logical precision that would eventually, when combined with the evidence of 1854 and the grand experiment, prove irresistible to the scientific community that outlived him. The grand experiment, as Snow called it, with a directness that was characteristic of his approach, was in some ways even more methodologically important than the Broad Street investigation, because it operated at a scale that made its findings almost impossible to attribute to coincidence or selective observation, and because it took advantage of a natural variation in the water supply of South London that created, without any deliberate experimental design, something close to the conditions of a controlled trial, distributing the population being studied across 2 different exposures and allowing mortality to serve as the outcome measure. The origins of the experiment lay in the geography of London's water supply in the late 1840s and early 185 zeros, when 2 major water companies, the Southwark and Vauxhall Water Company and the Lambeth Water Company, both drew their water from the Thames, but from different sections of the river. The Southwark and Vauxhall drawing from a stretch of the river that was heavily contaminated by the sewage of South London, while the Lambeth Company had in 1852 moved its intake point upstream to Ditton in Surrey, where the water was substantially cleaner and less contaminated by urban waste. The 2 companies supplied water to households across a large area of South London in a pattern that was, from the perspective of an experimenter, admirably mixed. The 2 supplies interleaved across the same streets and neighbourhoods in a distribution determined by historical accident, and the timing of connections rather than by any socio-economic sorting, so that comparable households on the same street might receive water from different companies and therefore might be exposed to very different levels of bacterial contamination without any other significant difference in their circumstances. Snow recognized immediately that this distribution created an opportunity for a comparison of mortality rates between populations, defined by their water supply rather than by their income or their location, or any other variable that might confirm the results. And he spent the summer and autumn of 1853 and the early months of 1854 methodically gathering the data he would need, going door to door in the affected districts, identifying the water company supplying each household, and recording those details alongside the mortality data from the General Register Office for the subsequent cholera epidemic of 1854. The results, when Snow tabulated them, were striking in their clarity. The areas supplied by the Southwark and Vauxhall Company showing a mortality rate from cholera of approximately 315 deaths per 100,000 houses, while the areas supplied by the Lambeth Company showed a rate of approximately 37 deaths per 100,000 houses, a difference of more than 8 to 1 that could not plausibly be attributed to any variable other than the quality of the water supply. These numbers, published in the 2nd edition of On the Mode of Communication of Cholera in 1855, represented what Snow described as a grand experiment on a large scale. An experiment conducted not in a laboratory, but in the lived environment of a major city, using the natural variation in its water supply to produce evidence of a kind that no laboratory experiment of the period could have generated evidence that was population-wide, geographically specific, and statistically powerful enough to constitute, in modern epidemiological terms, a very strong basis for causal inference. The intellectual structure of the grand experiment anticipated in important ways the logic of what would later become known as the natural experiment, a methodological approach that has become one of the most important tools in modern epidemiology and public health research. And Snow's use of it in 1854 and 1855 was a methodological innovation as significant as his use of dot mapping in the Broad Street investigation, demonstrating that the careful analysis of naturally occurring variation in exposures could reveal causal relationships that would otherwise be invisible to observation. It is worth noting that Snow conducted this enormous data gathering exercise largely alone, without assistance or funding or institutional support, moving through the streets of South London with his notebook, knocking on doors, asking about water suppliers, building a dataset that would have required a substantial team effort to assemble in a later era, a feat of individual scientific determination that speaks to the depth of his commitment to the question he was pursuing, and the confidence he had, perhaps quietly but surely, in the answer he expected to find. The years following the publication of Snow's 1855 edition were years of gradual, uneven, and sometimes frustrating progress toward the acceptance of the waterborne theory of cholera, progress that moved through the overlapping channels of scientific publication, public health administration, engineering practice, and political decision-making in ways that were rarely synchronized and rarely straightforward, but that were nonetheless moving, however haltingly, in a consistent direction. Snow himself did not live to see the full transformation, dying in June of 1858 at the age of 45, his health having been compromised by years of extraordinary professional dedication, and, some historians suggest, by the physiological consequences of his self-experimentation with anesthetic agents in the early years of his work in that field, a practice that was common among the pioneer anesthesiologists and that carried its own risks. In the immediate years after his death, the medical establishment maintained its formal adherence to the miasmatic framework, the official reports of the Board of Health continuing to attribute cholera to atmospheric causes, and the textbooks in use in the medical schools of London and Edinburgh and the other great British centres of medical education, continuing to teach miasma theory as the established explanation for epidemic disease. But the practical consequences of Snow's work were already beginning to make themselves felt in ways that did not require theoretical acceptance of his conclusions, most obviously in the accelerating pace of the water infrastructure improvements that his work had helped to motivate. The Bazalgette sewer system moving from planning into construction through the late 1850s and early 1860s, the water companies coming under increasing regulatory pressure to improve their filtration and their intake locations. The General Board of Health and its successor bodies, developing an increasingly detailed and practical understanding of the relationship between water quality and disease that was, whatever its theoretical language, functionally consistent with Snow's waterborne hypothesis. The epidemic of 1866, the last major cholera epidemic to strike London, served as a kind of final demonstration, an inadvertent natural experiment, in which the East London Water Company, whose service area included the East End districts of Poplar and Bromley, and the surrounding neighbourhoods, had failed to move its intake point upstream, as the Lambeth Company had done, and had not yet been connected to the improved sewage infrastructure of Bazalgette's system, with the result that its water supply in the summer of 1866 was essentially the same contaminated Thames water that had supplied those neighbourhoods in 1832 and 1849, while the rest of London, now served by cleaner water and better sewage infrastructure, remained largely free of the disease. William Farr, analysing the mortality data from the 1866 epidemic with his customary statistical thoroughness, found the pattern so clear and so consistent with the waterborne hypothesis that he could not, in intellectual honesty, continue to resist it, and his public acknowledgement of Snow's essential correctness, published in his analysis of the 1866 epidemic, marked a significant symbolic moment in the gradual transition of the medical establishment toward the germ theory of disease transmission. The 1866 epidemic killed approximately 14,000 people in London, a terrible toll, but significantly lower than the approximately 14,000 who had died in London alone in the epidemic of 1849, a decline that reflected not only the improvements in water infrastructure, but also the beginning of a change in the broader understanding of how to manage epidemic disease, a change that was still imperfect and incomplete, but that was measurably moving the numbers in the right direction, demonstrating in the most practical possible terms that public health was not merely an academic discipline, but an applied science capable of saving lives even in the absence of a complete theoretical understanding of the diseases it was fighting. Meanwhile, in the scientific world that lay beyond the immediate preoccupations of London's public health debates, the final piece of the intellectual puzzle that Snow had largely assembled was being shaped by developments in bacteriology and microbiology that would, over the decade of the 1880s, provide the biological explanation that the waterborne theory had always lacked: the identification of the specific organism responsible for cholera, and the demonstration of the precise mechanism by which that organism produced the symptoms and the deaths that had been observed for so long. Filippo Pacini, an Italian microscopist working in Florence, had actually identified the cholera bacterium in 1854, the same year as the Broad Street outbreak, examining the intestinal contents of cholera victims under the microscope and describing a small, curved, comma-shaped organism that he named Vibrio cholerae in a paper published in 1854 in the Gazzetta Medica Italiana, a publication that circulated in Italy but received little attention beyond its immediate readership, and whose findings were not incorporated into the broader scientific discussion of cholera in Britain or elsewhere, because the infrastructure for international scientific communication was still sufficiently underdeveloped that important observations could be published and simply not heard, disappearing into the archives without trace. Pacini continued his work on cholera through the 1860s and 1870s, publishing additional papers that elaborated his initial observation and argued for the bacterial cause of the disease with increasing sophistication, but he remained largely without influence on the mainstream of medical thinking about cholera, which continued to be dominated by the debate between miasmatic and waterborne theories, rather than by the emerging germ theory that Pacini's work represented. It was Robert Koch, the German physician and bacteriologist, who had already made fundamental contributions to the understanding of anthrax and tuberculosis, who in 1883 conducted the investigation that would finally establish, beyond reasonable scientific doubt, the bacterial cause of cholera and provide a biological mechanism that connected Vibrio cholerae to the waterborne transmission route that Snow had identified. Koch travelled to Egypt in the summer of 1883, where a cholera epidemic was underway, as part of a German scientific commission sent to investigate the outbreak, and there he isolated, from the intestinal contents of cholera victims, a small curved bacterium that he recognized from his study of the available literature as corresponding to the organism Pacini had described in 1854, and which he then proceeded to cultivate in pure culture and to characterize with the systematic thoroughness that had become his scientific signature. From Egypt, Koch traveled to India, to the source region of cholera in the Ganges Delta, where he found the same organism in the water of tanks and ponds used by local populations, and confirmed that the bacterium could be isolated both from the intestinal contents of the sick and from environmental water sources, providing the epidemiological connection between the organism and its mode of transmission that the germ theory required. Koch's identification of Vibrio cholerae as the causative agent of cholera, published in 1884 and presented to the German government in a formal report that drew considerable scientific and political attention, was received with the mixture of enthusiasm and skepticism that attends any major scientific claim, but the quality of his evidence was such that within a few years his conclusion had been broadly accepted by the international scientific community, and the theoretical framework for understanding cholera had been transformed, finally and irrevocably, from the domain of miasma and moral judgment into the domain of microbiology and water chemistry, from the realm of the speculative and the philosophical into the realm of the demonstrable and the measurable. The social and cultural consequences of cholera in the Victorian era extended far beyond the immediate terrain of medicine and public health, touching virtually every dimension of the life of the period, from literature and art to political philosophy and religious thought, from urban planning and architecture to the emerging discipline of statistics and the developing practice of investigative journalism. The fear of cholera was a defining feature of the emotional landscape of the 19th century in Europe and North America, a fear that was qualitatively different from the fear of other epidemic diseases, because of the speed and visibility of cholera's course, because the disease moved so quickly from apparent health to crisis, because it was so clearly associated with poverty and urban squalor, and because it seemed, in its democratic indifference to the pretensions of civilization, to expose the fragility of the social order in a way that was as politically as it was medically unsettling. The cholera epidemics of 1832 drove political reform in Britain in ways that are difficult to disentangle entirely from the broader currents of the reform movement of that period, but that were clearly significant. The epidemic arriving in the same year as the Reform Act that extended the franchise and restructured parliamentary representation, and the two events reinforcing each other in the public imagination as expressions of a general crisis in the established order, a sense that the old arrangements were no longer adequate to the realities of an industrial, urban society. The philosopher Thomas Carlyle, writing in the early 1830s, used cholera as a metaphor for the moral and social disease of industrial capitalism, describing the epidemic not merely as a physical event, but as a symptom of a deeper civilizational pathology, a judgment on a society that had allowed its poor to live in conditions that were, as he put it, a disgrace to any Christian nation. Language that captured the widespread tendency of the period to read cholera as a form of divine or social commentary on the conditions it exposed. The novelist Charles Dickens, whose career began in the early 1830s, in the shadow of the first English cholera epidemic, and who spent the following decades writing about the conditions of urban poverty that cholera had made impossible to ignore, was in a sense a literary epidemiologist of the Victorian city, his novels documenting the physical conditions of the slums and the workhouses, and the courts and alleys of London, with a vividness that owed something to his personal knowledge of those environments, and something to the acute social conscience that cholera and its consequences had helped to sharpen in a generation of writers and reformers who could no longer pretend that the poor were simply invisible. The social investigations of Henry Mayhew, whose London Labour and the London Poor, published in its extended form in the 1850s, provided an extraordinarily detailed ethnographic portrait of the working poor of the Victorian capital, were conducted in the same spirit of careful observation and factual documentation that characterized Snow's epidemiological work, and were motivated in part by the same cholera-driven awareness that the conditions of poverty were not merely aesthetically unpleasant, but medically dangerous in ways that threatened not only those who lived in them, but the wider social body as well. Religious responses to cholera were numerous and varied, ranging from the formal days of prayer and fasting proclaimed by the government during the epidemics of 1832 and 1849, events that drew considerable public participation and reflected the widespread interpretation of cholera as a visitation requiring a spiritual as well as a physical response to the more heterodox theological speculation of thinkers like the Reverend Charles Kingsley, who argued that the social conditions that produced cholera were themselves a moral failure requiring social rather than merely spiritual remediation, a position that helped to lay the groundwork for the social gospel movement of the later 19th century. It is worth reflecting, from the quiet distance of the present, that the cholera epidemics of the Victorian era were not merely medical events, but were also, in a profound sense, civic events. Moments when the invisible infrastructure of the city and the invisible conditions of the poor were made suddenly and undeniably visible to those who might otherwise have preferred not to see them, and when the question of what a society owed its most vulnerable members was forced onto the public agenda with an urgency that no amount of political inertia could entirely deflect. The relationship between cholera and the built environment of the Victorian city produced, over the course of the 19th century, a transformation in urban planning and infrastructure that was as significant in its long-term consequences as any of the purely medical or scientific developments associated with the disease. A transformation that rebuilt the physical fabric of London and other major cities in ways that are still visible and still functioning today, more than 150 years after they were designed. Joseph Bazalgette, the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, was the principal architect of this transformation in London. A man whose professional career overlapped almost precisely with the period of London's most acute cholera crisis, and whose greatest achievement, the underground sewer system constructed between 1859 and 1875, was as directly shaped by the cholera epidemics of the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s as John Snow's epidemiological work, though shaped by different forces and through different channels, and motivated by a different, if complementary, understanding of the problem. Bazalgette's system was, in its engineering conception, a response to the miasmatic theory rather than to Snow's waterborne hypothesis. designed to remove the foul-smelling waste of the city from the Thames within the built-up area, and thereby eliminate the miasmatic exhalations that were believed to be responsible for epidemic disease. But its practical effect, the removal of human sewage from the water supply of the city, was precisely what Snow's analysis indicated was necessary to prevent cholera. And the two different theoretical motivations converged in the engineering solution on the same practical outcome. The scale of Bazalgette's undertaking was remarkable, even by the standards of Victorian engineering, a period characterized by ambitious infrastructure projects and an almost unlimited faith in the capacity of organized human effort to reshape the physical environment. The sewer system, comprising over 80 miles of brick-built main sewers running beneath the streets and embankments of London, connecting to a network of more than 1,000 miles of smaller local sewers and street drains, moving the waste of the city eastward through a system of pumping stations to outfall points at Barking and Crossness on the lower Thames, where it could be discharged on the ebb tide. The construction of the system required not only extraordinary engineering, but extraordinary political will, since it involved the excavation of much of central London, the reconstruction of the Thames embankments on both the north and south banks of the river, the demolition and rebuilding of streets and foundations across large areas of the city, and the expenditure of sums that seemed, to those who had to approve them, almost incomprehensibly large. The total cost of the system, amounting to approximately £4.5 million, a figure that seems modest by contemporary standards, but that represented a significant fraction of the public finances of the period. The epidemiological consequences of the system, while not instantaneous, were profound and measurable. The frequency and severity of cholera epidemics in London, declining sharply through the 1870s and 1880s as the improved sewage infrastructure and the associated improvements in water filtration and supply took effect. The city's mortality statistics, showing a sustained downward trend in the diseases most closely associated with contaminated water, that continued through the end of the century and beyond. It is one of the quieter satisfactions of the history of public health that Bazalgette's sewers are still in use today, carrying the waste of 21st century London through the same brick tunnels that were built in the 1860s, supplemented and extended, but never entirely replaced. A physical monument to the Victorian conviction that the problems of the industrial city could be solved by the application of engineering intelligence and public investment. A conviction that was, in this instance at least, entirely correct. The international dimensions of cholera's history in the 19th century extended the lessons of London and Paris and Hamburg and New York into a global conversation about disease, sanitation, and the obligations of states toward their populations and toward each other. A conversation that produced, slowly and imperfectly, some of the earliest institutions of what we would now call global public health. The International Sanitary Conferences, the first of which was convened in Paris in 1851, under the auspices of Napoleon III's government, brought together representatives of the major European powers to discuss the harmonization of quarantine measures and the sharing of epidemiological information motivated primarily by the economic disruption that the competing quarantine regimes of different nations had imposed on international trade, but producing as a secondary consequence some of the earliest systematic attempts at international disease surveillance and the exchange of scientific information across national boundaries. The Paris Conference of 1851 was the first of 11 international sanitary conferences held between 1851 and 1903, a series of meetings that were often contentious, frequently inconclusive, and almost invariably shaped more by the conflicting commercial and political interests of the participating nations than by purely public health considerations, but that nonetheless created a precedent and a mechanism for international cooperation on epidemic disease that would eventually evolve into the more robust institutions of the 20th century. The debate at these conferences about the cause and transmission of cholera was itself a running scientific controversy, the representatives of the major powers bringing their national scientific communities' positions to the table and arguing them with a combination of empirical and political conviction that made progress slow and agreement elusive. The British delegation at various conferences defending first the miasmatic theory, and later, after Snow's work had become more widely accepted, the waterborne theory, while French and German delegations brought their own theoretical frameworks and their own national interests to bear on questions that were ostensibly purely scientific, but were never, in practice, separable from the economic consequences of the quarantine measures that different theories implied. It is worth noting that the cholera pandemics of the 19th century accelerated the development of international public health institutions in a way that no other disease of the period quite matched. The combination of cholera's speed, its visibility, its association with the water infrastructure that was the shared concern of all modern states, and its capacity to travel along the trade routes that were the arteries of the global economy, making it uniquely compelling as a driver of international cooperation. The fifth pandemic of 1881 to 1896, which coincided with Koch's identification of Vibrio cholerae and the beginning of the bacteriological era, spread from India through the Middle East and Russia and into Europe and North America, killing enormous numbers of people, approximately 25 million by some estimates, across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, and motivating a new round of international discussion about the appropriate response to epidemic disease that now, for the first time, could be grounded in a specific understanding of the causative agent and its mode of transmissions, rather than in competing and irreconcilable theoretical frameworks. The Hamburg epidemic of 1892, in which approximately 8,500 people died in a single German city in the space of a few weeks, was a particularly significant moment in this international conversation, both because it occurred in a wealthy and modern city, in the heart of industrial Europe, demonstrating that cholera was not merely a disease of colonial peripheries or pre-modern poverty, and because the neighboring city of Altona, which shared the same stretch of the Elbe, but drew its water from a filtered supply rather than directly from the river, suffered dramatically lower mortality, providing a clear and locally visible demonstration of the waterborne hypothesis that could not be attributed to differences in poverty or living conditions. The Hamburg epidemic of 1892 galvanized the German government's approach to water treatment and urban sanitation in ways that had lasting public health consequences, and it contributed to the growing international consensus that the control of cholera required above all the provision of clean, filtered, and eventually chlorinated drinking water to urban populations, a consensus that would shape public health investment and urban infrastructure development across the industrialized world through the early decades of the 20th century. and that would reduce cholera in Europe and North America over the following generations from a recurring pandemic threat to a historical memory. The narrative has moved through Victorian London's social geography and cholera's intersection with poverty, the intellectual structure and surprising utility of miasma theory, William Farr's statistical elevation law and his eventual conversion, John Snow's biography and developing hypothesis, the grand experiment comparing Southwark and Vauxhall versus Lambeth Water Companies, the social and literary consequences of cholera in Victorian culture, Bazalgette's sewer system and its engineering legacy, and the International Sanitary Conferences and Hamburg epidemic of 1892. Chapters 13 through 18 will cover Filippo Pacini's overlooked 1854 discovery, Robert Koch's 1883 bacteriological confirmation, the 6th and 7th pandemics, the development of oral rehydration therapy, modern cholera in Haiti and Yemen, and the gentle philosophical close returning the listener to their bed. Filippo Pacini was not a famous man, not in his own lifetime, and not for many decades after his death. And the story of his discovery of the cholera bacterium in 1854 is one of those quiet, melancholy chapters in the history of science in which a genuinely important observation is made at the wrong moment, in the wrong language, in the wrong journal, by a man without the institutional standing or the professional network to carry his findings into the broader conversation where they might have taken root and changed the course of events. Pacini was born in Pistoia, in the Tuscany region of Italy, in 1812, the son of a shoemaker. Educated through scholarships and personal determination, at the medical school of Florence, where he remained for most of his working life, as a professor of anatomy, a careful and methodical microscopist who had already made significant contributions to neuroanatomy before he turned his attention to cholera in the epidemic year of 1854. Florence experienced a severe outbreak of cholera in that year, and Pacini, working in the anatomical theatre of the Ospedale di Santa Maria Nuova, examined the intestinal contents and the intestinal lining of cholera victims under the microscope with a thoroughness that was characteristic of his approach to all scientific questions, describing what he saw with the precision of a trained anatomist, and recognizing in the curved, comma-shaped organisms, he observed something that he believed to be the causative agent of the disease, rather than merely an incidental finding. He published his observations in the Gazzetta Medica Italiana in 1854, under the title Microscopical Observations and Pathological Deductions on Cholera, naming the organism he had observed Vibrio cholerae, and arguing, with a clarity that in retrospect seems remarkable, that the disease was caused by this specific organism, acting on the cells of the intestinal lining to produce the fluid losses characteristic of the illness, a description that was not only correct in its identification of the causative agent, but also contained within it the germ of an understanding of the mechanism of cholera toxin that would not be fully elaborated until the 20th century. The paper was published, distributed to the subscribers of the Gazzetta Medica Italiana, and then, in the manner of important observations made in the wrong place, at the wrong time, it faded from the scientific conversation, unread by Snow in London, and unread by the German bacteriologists who were beginning their work in Berlin, uncited and unacknowledged in the great debates about miasma and water that were occupying the attention of the medical world during the 1850s and 186 zeros. Pacini continued his work, publishing additional papers on cholera through the 1860s and 1870s that elaborated and confirmed his original observations, arguing for the bacterial cause of the disease, with increasing evidence and increasing frustration as the scientific establishment of Northern Europe continued to debate theoretical frameworks without, apparently, reading his contributions. He died in Florence in 1883, the same year that Robert Koch travelled to Egypt to begin the investigation that would bring him, independently, to the same conclusion that Pacini had reached nearly 30 years earlier. And Koch's bacteriological confirmation of Vibrio cholerae, published in 1884, was celebrated as a fundamental discovery without any reference to Pacini's earlier work, an omission that was not malicious, but that reflected the imperfect state of international scientific communication in the 19th century, and the degree to which the Italian language scientific literature was, for practical purposes, invisible to the German and British and French scientists who dominated the emerging field of bacteriology. It was not until 1965, more than 80 years after Pacini's death, that the International Committee on Nomenclature of Bacteria formally acknowledged his priority by ruling that the correct name of the cholera bacterium was Vibrio cholerae Pacini, 1854, a posthumous recognition that restored his name to the scientific record and ensured that the history of bacteriology now includes, alongside Koch's celebrated identification, the earlier and equally precise observation of a Florentine anatomist who saw the truth clearly in 1854 and simply had no mechanism to make the world hear him. The story of Filippo Pacini is, in its quiet way, a reminder that the history of science is not merely the history of great discoveries, but also the history of the conditions that determine whether discoveries are heard, whether they enter the conversation, whether they are given the opportunity to change the thinking of those who might use them, and that the infrastructure of scientific communication is itself a kind of public health resource, capable of determining whether a correct idea reaches those who need it or disappears into the archive to wait patiently for someone else to find it again. Robert Koch arrived in Alexandria, Egypt, in August of 1883 as the leader of a German scientific commission sent by the German government to investigate the cholera epidemic. Then underway in that city, a commission that also included Georg Gafke, who would later make his own significant contributions to bacteriology, and that was motivated in part by the competitive dynamic between Germany and France that characterized so much of European scientific life in the decades following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871. A dynamic in which the identification of the disease-causing bacteria had become a form of national scientific prestige, as well as a matter of public health. Koch was by 1883 already one of the most celebrated scientists in the world. His identification of the anthrax bacillus in 1876 and the tuberculosis bacillus in 1882, having established him as the leading practitioner of the new science of bacteriology and having earned him a degree of international recognition that was unusual in an era when scientific fame was more circumscribed than it would later become. His tuberculosis announcement in particular having been received in Berlin with something approaching the atmosphere of a public event. He brought to Egypt the techniques and the conceptual framework of the Koch school of bacteriology, the rigorous protocols for isolating and cultivating bacteria in pure culture, the systematic application of what would become known as kokos, postulates as criteria for establishing that a specific organism was the cause of a specific disease, and the methodological thoroughness that had characterized his earlier work, and that would characterize the Egyptian and Indian investigations as well. In Alexandria, working in improvised laboratory conditions in a local hospital, Koch examined the intestinal contents and the rice water stools as the characteristic fluid evacuations of cholera were clinically described of patients who had died of the disease, and identified in those specimens the small curved bacteria that Pacini had described in 1854, cultivating them in pure culture on gelatine media and characterizing their morphology and growth characteristics with the systematic precision that was the hallmark of his approach. The epidemic in Egypt was waning by the time Koch arrived, which limited his ability to conduct the full range of investigations he would have liked. And he was unable, in Egypt, to fulfill all the requirements of his own postulates for establishing the causal relationship between the bacterium and the disease, since reproducing the disease in experimental animals proved difficult and the epidemic was receding. Before he could accumulate sufficient clinical material, Koch therefore travelled to India, specifically to Calcutta in the Bengal region, where cholera was endemic, and where he could study the disease in its home territory, examining the water of tanks and ponds and wells used by local populations, and finding in those environmental samples the same curved bacteria he had isolated it from human cases in Egypt, providing the environmental link between the organism and the contaminated water that Snow's waterborne hypothesis had required, and that now, with Koch's bacteriological confirmation, could be stated not merely as an epidemiological inference, but as a demonstrated fact of microbiology. His report to the German government, published in 1884, described in detail the morphology of the organism he called the comma bacillus, its growth characteristics, its distribution in the stools of cholera patients, and in contaminated water sources, and his conclusion that Vibrio cholerae was the specific causative agent of Asiatic cholera, a conclusion that was received with considerable enthusiasm by the scientific community, and with the mixture of admiration and competitive anxiety that Koch's announcements habitually provoked in his French counterparts, most notably Louis Pasteur, whose own school of bacteriology in Paris had been following the cholera question with keen interest, and who was not entirely pleased to see Koch achieve this particular priority. The acceptance of Koch's identification of Vibrio cholerae was not instantaneous or universal, the most notable resistance coming from Max von Pettenkofer in Munich, who had his own theory of cholera causation, involving a specific soil factor that he believed was necessary in addition to the bacterium to produce the disease, and who was so convinced of this view that he famously drank a culture of Vibrio cholerae in 1892 to demonstrate that the bacterium alone was insufficient to cause illness, surviving the experience without developing cholera, and interpreting this as confirmation of his theory, when in fact it more likely reflected some combination of prior partial immunity, the specific characteristics of the culture he consumed, and the variability of individual susceptibility that is a genuine feature of cholera biology. Koch's identification did not answer every question about cholera, as von Pettenkofer's survival illustrated, but it provided the essential foundation on which a scientific understanding of the disease could be built, and within a decade of his 1884 report, the bacterial cause of cholera was accepted by virtually all working bacteriologists, and the theoretical debate that had occupied the medical world since the 1830s was effectively resolved, the question having shifted from what causes cholera to how the causative organism can best be identified, controlled, and eventually eliminated. The sixth cholera pandemic, which began approximately in 1899 and persisted through the first decade and a half of the 20th century, was in many ways the last great pandemic of the classical cholera era, the last occasion on which the disease moved through the patterns of the previous century, traveling from its reservoir in India through the networks of trade and pilgrimage and military movement into the Middle East and Russia and parts of Europe, killing millions of people in Asia and hundreds of thousands in Europe, and doing so against a background of scientific understanding that was now, for the first time, adequate to explain what was happening, even if it was not yet fully adequate to prevent it. The sixth pandemic coincided with the early years of the bacteriological era in public health, the years when the identification of specific disease-causing organisms was beginning to be translated into practical preventive measures, when the first cholera vaccines were being developed and tested, when water treatment technologies, including filtration, and the emerging practice of chlorination were being applied to the water supplies of major cities with measurable results, and when the international public health infrastructure established through the international sanitary conferences was beginning to acquire the institutional permanence and the technical capacity to function as a genuine instrument of epidemic control, rather than merely a forum for diplomatic discussion. The bacteriologist Waldemar Hafkine, working in India under the auspices of the Indian Medical Service, developed the first cholera vaccine in the early 1890s, testing it on a large scale in the populations of the Ganges Delta during the epidemic years of 1893 and 1894, producing results that suggested the vaccine offered significant, if incomplete, protection against the disease, and that demonstrated, for the first time, that mass vaccination against cholera was practically feasible even in the conditions of a developing colonial administration. Hafkine's work was conducted under difficult circumstances, and with the kind of skeptical reception from established medical authorities that seemed, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, to be the standard response to genuinely innovative public health proposals. But his results were sufficiently compelling to influence the vaccination programs that subsequent colonial and national health authorities would develop over the following decades, and his name deserves more recognition in the standard histories of cholera than it typically receives. The sixth pandemic moved through Russia, Persia, Arabia, and the Ottoman territories, with a severity that caused enormous suffering, the pilgrimage routes to Mecca and Medina being particularly significant corridors of transmission, the Hajj having been identified since the 1830s as a major mechanism for the international spread of cholera, the gathering of hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from across the Islamic world in conditions of great physical stress and limited water, and sanitation infrastructure creating ideal conditions for cholera to move from a local outbreak into an international epidemic with remarkable speed. The international response to cholera on the pilgrimage routes produced, over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, a complex set of institutional arrangements and diplomatic negotiations that intertwined the politics of the Ottoman Empire, the colonial interests of the European powers, the religious sensitivities surrounding Islamic practice, and the practical demands of epidemic control in ways that resisted simple resolution and that generated their own significant body of archival material in the records of the international sanitary conferences and the foreign offices of the major powers. By the time the sixth pandemic had run its course, approximately in 1923, The map of cholera had changed significantly from what it had been a century earlier, the disease having retreated from most of Europe and North America, and becoming increasingly a disease associated with Asia and parts of Africa, a geographical concentration that reflected both the success of water and sanitation improvements in the industrialized world and the persistent inadequacy of those improvements in the countries that remained most vulnerable, a disparity that would define the geography of cholera for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. The seventh cholera pandemic, which began in the Sulawesi region of Indonesia in 1961, and which continues in certain parts of the world to this day, is in several respects a fundamentally different kind of pandemic from its predecessors, caused by a different biotype of Vibrio cholerae called L. tor, rather than the classical biotype responsible for the first 6 pandemics, and displaying a pattern of transmission and a global geography that reflects the particular features of the second half of the 20th century, the patterns of international travel and refugee displacement, and rapid urbanization in the developing world that have replaced the trade caravans and pilgrimage routes and colonial supply chains of the 19th century as the primary mechanisms of cholera's movement across the globe. The L. tor biotype was first isolated in 1905 at the L. tor quarantine station on the Sinai Peninsula, where it was found in pilgrims returning from Mecca, and it was initially regarded as a less virulent variant of the classical strain, a judgment that subsequent history would substantially revise, as L. tor demonstrated itself to be not less virulent, but more persistent, more capable of surviving in environmental water sources, and more adept at producing the asymptomatic carriage that allows it to spread through a population without the immediate and dramatic signal of widespread clinical disease. The seventh pandemic moved from Indonesia westward through Asia and into the Middle East and Africa through the 1960s and 1970s, reaching West Africa in 1970 in an outbreak that was particularly significant because it demonstrated that large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which had been largely spared by previous cholera pandemics, were highly susceptible to the L. tor biotype, and that the rapid urbanization of African cities, combined with inadequate water and sanitation infrastructure, created conditions for cholera transmission that were in some respects comparable to those of Victorian London a century earlier. The African outbreak of 1970 and the subsequent spread of the seventh pandemic across the continent killed hundreds of thousands of people over the following decades and demonstrated with uncomfortable clarity that the advances in water treatment and sanitation that had effectively eliminated cholera from Europe and North America had not been shared with the parts of the world where the disease continued to circulate, and that the global geography of cholera was, in an important sense, a map of the global geography of inequality, marking out the places where investment in clean water and adequate sanitation had been made, and the places where it had not. The pandemic reached Latin America in 1991, appearing in Peru in January of that year in an outbreak that spread with extraordinary speed through the coastal cities of the country and then moved throughout South and Central America, an epidemic that had not been seen in the Western Hemisphere for more than a century, and that killed approximately 10,000 people while infecting well over 1 million in its first 2 years. An outbreak that has been linked by some researchers to changes in coastal water temperatures associated with an El Niño event that may have stimulated the growth of plankton blooms carrying Vibrio cholerae in the coastal waters of Peru The seventh pandemic also demonstrated, in its long course through the second half of the 20th century, the potential of oral rehydration therapy to transform the case fatality rate of cholera from the figures of 10 to 50% that had characterized untreated cases in the 19th century to figures well below 1% when treatment was available and administered promptly. A transformation that represented one of the most significant therapeutic advances in the history of infectious disease, and one of the simplest and most elegant solutions to a problem that the complexity of modern medicine might have been expected to require something more sophisticated to solve. Oral rehydration therapy, the treatment that transformed cholera from a frequently fatal disease into a readily manageable one, is built on a physiological insight of remarkable simplicity. The discovery that the intestine's capacity to absorb water is not entirely destroyed by the action of cholera toxin, but can be partially preserved and exploited if glucose and sodium are provided simultaneously in the correct ratio, a finding that exploited the sodium-glucose cotransport mechanism in the intestinal cells that remains functional, even when the normal secretory processes of those cells have been disrupted by the bacterial toxin. The scientific work that led to this discovery was conducted over several decades through the 1950s and 1960s, drawing on basic research into intestinal physiology by scientists including Robert Crane, who described the glucose-sodium cotransport mechanism in 1960, and on clinical observations made in cholera research facilities in Dhaka, in what was then East Pakistan and is now Bangladesh, and in Calcutta, where researchers including Norbert Hirschhorn, David Nallen, and Richard Cash conducted the trials in the late 1960s that demonstrated the clinical efficacy of oral rehydration in treating cholera patients. Findings published in The Lancet in 1968 that the journal would later describe as potentially the most important medical advance of the 20th century. The simplicity of oral rehydration solution, a mixture of clean water, sugar, and salt in carefully specified proportions, was both its greatest strength and one of the reasons it was initially undervalued in the medical world of the 1960s, a world accustomed to looking for complex pharmaceutical solutions to serious medical problems, and inclined to regard a treatment so simple that it could be prepared in a household kitchen as insufficiently sophisticated to be genuinely effective against a disease that had killed millions. It was not until the cholera epidemic in the refugee camps of Bangladesh in 1971, during the War of Independence that created the new nation, that oral rehydration therapy demonstrated its potential on a mass scale. The physician John Rode and his colleagues, treating thousands of patients in the MATLAB area with oral rehydration solution and achieving case fatality rates of less than 1% in a situation where intravenous fluids were unavailable and where without oral rehydration, the mortality would have been catastrophic, a demonstration so compelling that it began the process of transforming oral rehydrations from a promising research finding into a global public health policy. The World Health Organization and UNICEF formally endorsed oral rehydration therapy in the early 1970s and began the work of disseminating both the knowledge and the materials required to apply it widely in the developing world, a process that has saved an estimated 50 to 70 million lives over the 5 decades since the initial clinical demonstrations, a figure so large that it requires some effort of imagination to appreciate, representing not a statistic, but an accumulation of individual lives, of children who grew up and became parents and grandparents, of families that remained intact, of communities that were spared the particular devastation, of losing their youngest and their most vulnerable members to a disease that a packet of sugar and salt and clean water could have prevented. The development and dissemination of oral rehydration therapy is, in its way, as important a chapter in the history of cholera as the removal of the Broad Street pump handle or the construction of Bazalgette sewers, each of these events representing a different kind of intervention, a different application of accumulated knowledge to the practical problem of saving lives, and each of them demonstrating that the history of medicine is not a smooth progression, but a series of specific insights applied in specific places and times by specific people who were paying careful attention to the evidence in front of them. The cholera outbreak that began in Haiti in October 2010, in the months following the devastating earthquake of January of that year, is one of the more deeply sorrowful chapters in the modern history of the disease. An outbreak that introduced cholera to a population that had no prior exposure to it and no established immunity in a country whose water and sanitation infrastructure had been inadequate even before the earthquake and had been further disrupted by the catastrophic damage the earthquake had caused. And that has been linked through extensive epidemiological and genetic investigation to the introduction of Vibrio cholerae L-Tor by United Nations peacekeeping troops from Nepal, where cholera was endemic, whose waste was discharged into the Artibonite River, a river that served as a primary water source for communities throughout the central plateau of Haiti. The Haiti outbreak grew with a speed that reflected both the absence of prior immunity in the population and the inadequacy of the water and sanitation infrastructure, spreading from the Artibonite Valley throughout the country within weeks, and eventually infecting more than 800,000 people and killing more than 9,000 between 2010 and 2019. Numbers that, set against the population of a country of approximately 10 million, represent an extraordinary public health catastrophe, and that drew sustained attention from the international public health community, as well as from advocates for justice, who argued that the United Nations bore responsibility for the outbreak and an obligation to compensate its victims. The genetic analysis of the Haiti strain, published by researchers in 2011, and subsequently confirmed by additional studies, traced the outbreak to a single introduction event involving a strain of Vibrio cholerae, closely related to strains circulating in South Asia, specifically Nepal, and this genetic evidence, combined with epidemiological data about the timing and location of the initial cases and the proximity of the UN camp's waste disposal to the river, formed the basis of the scientific consensus that the outbreak was introduced by the UN peacekeeping contingent, a conclusion that the United Nations initially declined to acknowledge officially, but that it eventually, in 2016, formally recognized through a statement of apology and a commitment to provide material assistance to affected communities, a commitment that, in the estimation of many public health advocates, was never fully honored in terms of the financial resources actually provided. The Haiti outbreak serves as a reminder that cholera in the 21st century is not only a disease of the distant past or of abstract historical processes, but a living public health threat that can emerge with devastating consequences in any population, where the combination of susceptibility, contaminated water, and inadequate sanitation creates the conditions the bacterium requires, conditions that poverty and disaster and political instability can create very quickly in communities that may have been managing adequately before some catastrophic disruption altered the fundamentals of their daily life. The outbreak in Yemen, which began in 2016 in the context of the civil war that has devastated that country since 2015, became by 2017 the largest cholera epidemic in recorded history, with more than 2 million suspected cases reported by the end of that year, and the epidemic continuing to circulate through a population whose water and health infrastructure had been systematically destroyed by years of conflict, the bombing of water treatment facilities, and the displacement of millions of people into conditions without adequate sanitation, creating a humanitarian and epidemiological catastrophe of dimensions that public health organizations struggled to manage even with the most determined international assistance. The Yemen epidemic, still ongoing in its aftermath through the early 2020s, demonstrated with painful clarity that the conditions that allow cholera to establish itself are fundamentally conditions of poverty, conflict, and the destruction of infrastructure, conditions that no amount of medical knowledge or therapeutic sophistication can prevent if the social and political circumstances that create them are not also addressed, and that the history of cholera is therefore not merely a medical history, but a political and social history, inseparable from the questions of how societies organize themselves, how they distribute resources, and what obligations the powerful feel toward the vulnerable in moments of extreme need. The story of cholera is, among other things, a story about the slow and patient process by which human beings learn to understand the invisible world, the world of organisms too small to see, and processes too subtle to observe directly, that shapes so much of the visible world of illness and health and death. It is a story that took approximately 2,000 years to move from the first recorded descriptions of a cholera-like illness in the river deltas of ancient India to the identification of its causative organism in the laboratories of Florence and Egypt and Calcutta. 2,000 years during which millions of people died of a disease that could, in principle, be prevented by the provision of clean water, and that was prevented in practice once the connection between contaminated water and the specific bacterium was understood and acted upon. John Snow, working in the streets of Soho with his notebook in the late summer of 1854, was not the beginning of this story and not its end, but he occupies a particular place in it, a place defined not by any single discovery or any single paper, but by a quality of methodological imagination that recognized the city as a laboratory, the distribution of disease as a form of evidence, and the patient accumulation of specific local facts as a path to general truths that could not be reached by any other route. Snow did not know about Vibrio cholerae, did not know about Koch's postulates, or the germ theory, or the sodium glucose cotransport mechanism that would make oral rehydration therapy possible. But he knew how to look, knew how to compare, and to test, and to follow the evidence with a rigor that transcended the theoretical limitations of his era. And this quality of looking, this fundamental epidemiological disposition toward the specific and the verifiable, was his enduring contribution to medicine and to the much broader project of understanding how the world works. Henry Whitehead, the young curate who began as Snow's skeptic and became his most important collaborator, contributed to that project a different but equally essential quality: the willingness to listen to communities and to take seriously the specific circumstances of specific individuals rather than treating the data points of an epidemic as abstractions to be manipulated from a distance, and the combination of Snow's systematic analysis and Whitehead's pastoral knowledge of the Soho community produced, together, a model for epidemiological investigation that recognized both the power of population-level data and the irreducible importance of the individual case. The removal of the Broad Street pump handle in September 1854 was, as a physical act, something almost trivially small, a wrench applied to a single piece of iron on a single street in a single city. But as a symbolic act, it was something very large, a moment in which the accumulated knowledge of 2,000 years of observation, theory, argument, and evidence was condensed into a practical intervention that directly saved lives, and that demonstrated, for anyone willing to see it, that epidemic disease was not a supernatural visitation or a moral judgment, but a natural phenomenon susceptible to rational investigation and practical control. It is worth resting with that image for a moment. The image of a pump handle being removed on a quiet September morning in 1854, before the bacterium had been named, before the germ theory had been established, before oral rehydration or chlorination, or any of the other tools of modern public health had been imagined, and to appreciate the peculiar courage and patience of a man who trusted his evidence enough to act on it, before the world was ready to understand why he was right. The legacy of the cholera pandemics, spread across 2 centuries and 7 global episodes, is not only visible in the scientific and medical institutions they helped to create, in the epidemiological methods they drove the development of, and the public health infrastructure they motivated the construction of, but also in the quieter and more personal ways that contact with epidemic disease changes the texture of a civilization's understanding of itself and of the obligations of its members toward one another. The Victorian sanitary reform movement, energized by cholera and by the documentation of poverty that cholera made impossible to avoid, produced not only the sewers of Bazalgette, but a broader transformation in the relationship between the state and the citizen, a gradual expansion of the idea that government bore some responsibility for the physical conditions in which its most vulnerable members lived, an idea that was not new in the 1830s, but that the cholera epidemics helped to move from the margins of political philosophy toward the center of practical governance. The Public Health Act of 1848, pushed through Parliament in the aftermath of the second major English cholera epidemic by the efforts of Edwin Chadwick and his allies in the sanitary reform movement, established for the first time in British law a framework for the centralized regulation of public health, creating local boards of health with powers to inspect and improve water supplies, drainage, and housing conditions, and establishing the principle that the prevention of epidemic disease was a legitimate function of government, rather than merely a private matter between individuals and their physicians. The Public Health Act of 1875, which built on and substantially strengthened the 1848 legislation, consolidated and extended the framework of municipal public health administration in ways that gave local authorities clear powers and clear responsibilities for the water supply, sewage disposal, and housing standards that determined the epidemic disease burden of their populations, and that created the institutional infrastructure through which the gains in life expectancy and reduction in infectious disease mortality that characterized the late Victorian and Edwardian periods were achieved. Gains that represented not the triumph of any single medical discovery, but the cumulative effect of consistent investment in the physical conditions of urban life. It is worth noting, with a certain gentle wonder, that the children born in London in the 1880s and 1890s, growing up in the neighbourhoods served by Bazalgette's sewers, and the improved water supplies that followed from the campaigns. Snow and Chadwick and Simon and Farr had variously contributed to, had a life expectancy significantly greater than that of children born in the same neighbourhoods 30 years earlier, a difference made not by antibiotics or vaccines, but by the removal of Vibrio cholerae from the drinking water, by the simple, enormous gift of water that did not kill you. The international institutions that cholera helped to create, the international sanitary conferences of the 19th century, and the international sanitary regulations they eventually produced, evolved over the course of the 20th century into the international health regulations of the World Health Organization, the framework through which the global community today manages the notification and response to diseases capable of international spread, a framework that, while imperfect and always subject to the tensions between national sovereignty and international obligation that characterized its 19th century predecessors, represents a genuine and functioning instrument of global public health cooperation that would not exist in its present form without the long history of cholera, forcing the nations of the world to grapple repeatedly and urgently with the question of how to respond collectively to a threat that no single country could manage alone. Modern science has given us, in the decades since Koch's identification of Vibrio cholerae, an understanding of the biology of cholera that is both precise and, in certain respects, unexpectedly humbling, revealing a bacterium of considerable evolutionary sophistication, whose relationship with the human gut and with the aquatic environment is more complex and more dynamic than the early bacteriologists could have imagined, and whose capacity for genetic change and adaptation ensures that the story of cholera, however far it has progressed, is not yet finished. The cholera toxin, the specific protein produced by Vibrio cholerae that is responsible for the massive fluid losses characteristic of the disease, was purified and characterized by the American physician Robert Finkelstein in the 1960s, and its molecular mechanism was subsequently elucidated in detail, revealing that it works by entering the cells of the intestinal lining and activating a cellular enzyme called adenylate cyclase, causing those cells to pump chloride ions into the intestinal lumen in a process that draws water osmotically after it, producing the profuse watery stools that define the clinical picture of severe cholera, and that, untreated, can remove so much fluid from the body so quickly that death from dehydration can occur within hours of the onset of symptoms. This molecular understanding of the toxin mechanism was the scientific basis for the development of oral rehydration therapy, since it explained why the glucosodium cotransport pathway remained functional, even in the presence of the toxin, and therefore why oral rehydration could replace the fluids lost through the action of the toxin without requiring the intestinal cells to perform the normal absorptive functions that the toxin had disrupted. The gene encoding the cholera toxin is carried on a bacteriophage, a virus that infects bacteria called the CTX phage, a discovery made in the 1980s that revealed an unexpected and somewhat disquieting feature of cholera's biology, namely that the capacity to produce the toxin responsible for the disease is not an inherent property of Vibrio cholerae, but is conferred by a viral infection of the bacterium, meaning that the pathogenicity of cholera is, at a molecular level, the consequence of a three-way interaction between the bacterium, the virus that carries its toxin genes, and the human or animal host in which that interaction plays out. The seventh pandemic strain, the L-Tor biotype, has demonstrated over its 60-year course an ongoing capacity for genetic change, with variants carrying altered toxin genes appearing in Bangladesh in the 1990s and spreading internationally, and a hybrid strain combining features of the L-Tor and classical biotypes emerging in the early 21st century and causing severe disease in regions where the L-Tor strain alone had previously produced relatively mild illness. A reminder that the biological story of cholera is still being written, and that the evolutionary relationship between Vibrio cholerae and its human host is not static but dynamic, capable of producing new configurations with new clinical characteristics that require ongoing surveillance and ongoing adaptation of the public health response. The O139 serogroup of Vibrio cholerae, which emerged in Bangladesh and India in 1992, and briefly appeared to be the beginning of an eighth pandemic, demonstrated the potential for new variants to arise and spread rapidly in a globally connected world, appearing to threaten a replay of the classical pandemic pattern before being contained. For reasons that are still not entirely understood and partially displaced by the continuing dominance of the L-Tor biotype, an episode that provided both a warning and, in its containment, a measure of reassurance about the capacity of the modern public health system to respond to emerging cholera threats with a speed and effectiveness that would have been unimaginable in the era of Jon Snow. The ongoing presence of cholera in the world of the 21st century, in the waters of the Ganges Delta and the Lake Chad Basin and the river systems of sub-Saharan Africa and the conflict zones of the Middle East, is a reminder that the distance between the world of the 1854 Broad Street pump and the world of today is, in the most important respects, not a distance of scientific knowledge, but a distance of access. The distance between the populations who have clean water and those who do not, a distance that is narrowing, but that has not yet been closed, and that will not be closed by science alone, but only by the combination of science and the political will to act on what science has so clearly and so patiently revealed. And so we come, gently, to the end of this long drift through time and water, and the slow turning of human understanding, this journey that began in the warm river deltas of ancient India and moved through the crowded streets of Victorian London and the improvised laboratories of 19th century bacteriology and the refugee camps of the 20th century, to arrive here quietly in the 21st century, where Vibrio cholerae still lives in its coastal waters, and human beings still sometimes fail to protect one another from it, but where the knowledge of how to prevent it and how to treat it is clear, established, and available, waiting only for the will and the resources to apply it. Johns rests in Brompton Cemetery in London, beneath a modest stone in a quiet part of the grounds, and the street where the pump once stood is now called Broadwick Street, and there is a replica pump there, handleless as it has always been in its commemorative form, and a pub called the Jon Snow, where on an ordinary evening, people sit with their drinks in the warm light and do not think, as they could not be expected to think, about the cholera that once moved through the water beneath their feet, and the quiet physician who mapped it, who counted the dead and interviewed the survivors, and drew his lines on his map, and carried his findings to a meeting room, and changed, with the removal of a single iron handle, the direction of the history of medicine. Over the next century and a half, the insights he helped to establish would flow outward through the world, in the form of sewers and water, treatment plants and vaccination programs. and oral rehydration packets, and the epidemiological methods that are now the standard tools of every public health investigation, from the tracing of a foodborne illness outbreak in a small town to the mapping of a global pandemic. And that debt, that quiet ongoing debt to the careful observation of a physician in Soho in the late summer of 1854, is one that the world has not fully acknowledged, and perhaps never entirely can, because the lives saved by an epidemic that does not happen leave no monument and no grave, only the ordinary invisible continuance of people going about their days, drinking their water, breathing their air, carrying their children home in the evening through streets where the cholera no longer waits. Here, in this present moment, you are safe and warm, and the past is settling around you like a soft and familiar weight, the centuries folding back upon themselves in the quiet dark behind your eyes. All those names and dates and streets and faces drifting away as gently as river fog over. Still water at the first pale edge of dawn, the Ganges and the Thames and the Artibonite, flowing on in the dark somewhere far away, while here you are, breathing slowly, letting the history drift, letting the weight of the day and the weight of the centuries soften and dissolve until there is nothing left but the quiet sound of your own breathing, and the darkness, and the rest you so well deserve.